on to the third topic, godly admonitions. Jeff put these on the radar for us. We just amended the canon yesterday to make them clearer and more useful. I want to talk with you just a little bit about the creative value of a godly admonition. Here are the technical requirements. It's got to be written, it has to be from a bishop with jurisdiction. It can only occur after the bishop meets in person with the clergy receiving the godly admonition. Now you can give it to them at that meeting, but there has to be the meeting. And it has to be specific. The matter complained of, but also the canonical or theological basis for the concern. And then you have to give reasonable time for any actions that are required.
Scott, if I may, do you mind me?
Can you save it till we get
Sure,
to the question and answer?
I'll wait.
Just because we're a little short on time. And let me think with you creatively about this. A godly admonition can be used before you are imposing another form of discipline. We found them very useful in a variety of settings. Particularly, I've found them useful in the investigative process, because the bishop can give a godly admonition to the clergy who's being investigated to do things to cooperate with the investigation. We had a situation in my diocese a year or so ago where the godly admonition was to the clergy person saying, you will not delete any electronic evidence, you will not change any accounts, you will turn over the passwords to your online accounts to the person that the bishop is having look into this, and you will allow your computer, laptop, and cell phone to undergo a forensic examination by a forensic computer firm chosen by the diocese. That process was critical, and it's critical for two reasons. If the clergy person cooperates, you get evidence that may exonerate the clergy person or may help you more accurately determine what the misconduct is. If the clergy person refuses to cooperate or only partially cooperates, then you have a violation of a godly admonition that is the basis for discipline, and may be much easier to prove than the underlying accusation itself, particularly in the areas of sexual misconduct or electronic or online misconduct. This is the thing that may help you crystallize the problem in a way that allows discipline, and that can reduce some of the problems that Mo's talked about when you've got questions of proof, or when you're trying to say, he said, this other person said. Now, I would encourage you also to think in terms of how can it be used in a pastoral and redemptive way? And Jeff touched on that, so I'll leave it there. My final admonition about godly admonitions, as we all know, with great power comes great responsibility. Now that's not Solomon, that's Uncle Ben Parker, Spider-Man's uncle, but it's nonetheless true. And so whenever you are advising your bishop about the use of a godly admonition, you should do it with a very, very deep humility and an awareness that you're wielding a power that can be used in very, very helpful and responsible ways, but if abused or misused, which was an experience that we have seen in action many times in our former setting, it is extremely damaging, not only to the individual, but ultimately to the diocese and the bishop. Okay, the next to last stop in our high-speed tour, what are the preventive practices that you should put in place as a diocese? Well, first of all, every diocese should have a bishop, because without saying, in a standing committee. You're not a diocese if you don't. Secondly, you should have a chancellor. That's not a requirement. Every diocese doesn't have one. We heartily plead with you, have a chancellor. It's incredibly valuable. Third, you should think about having some sort of investigative capacity that may or may not be your canonical investigator. But you don't want to have to build that airplane when you're in the middle of the crisis. You want to have it in place so you can invoke it ahead of time. Fourthly, you do need a canonical investigator. And then, of course, you need, fifthly, a diocesan trial court. By canon, you must, and practically you should, and we can all pray that it's kind of like having fire insurance. You have it, and it never is needed, thank God. Okay, what else should you have? Well, I want to suggest you need to have several policies. First of all, you must have in place an unlawful harassment policy. Now notice that I say unlawful harassment, because we're living in a moment that tends to think anything that can be considered harassment is therefore unlawful, and yet routinely engages in forms of harassing behavior that it thinks nothing of. you want to have a policy that's very clear. This is only unlawful harassment. Second consideration there, your harassment policy must recognize that religion is different from other protected classes, and especially for religious organizations like the Church of God. I actually had to sue the EEOC about 10 years ago because they insisted that for pastors to pray for their janitor and to give their janitor a Christian book was a form of unlawful religious harassment. Philadelphia office, I filed 2 briefs, and it's a janitor at a church. On the first phone call, I said, I'll quote you a Supreme Court case that says they're under the Title VII, Section 702 exemption. You can't sue them for this. It's jurisdictional. You don't even have authority to investigate. 2 briefs, they said, sorry, we're going forward with the investigation. So we said, fine, we'll see you in court, filed suit. Literally the day the U.S. Attorney became involved, they asked us to send them our briefs that we'd given the EEOC. They called back and they said, so if we give the right to sue letter and say the EEOC's done, would you dismiss the lawsuit? Because we think we can be done with this. The EEOC, that office at that time, didn't get that it is not religious harassment for a religious organization to engage in the full range of religious activities. That recognition is declining in our increasingly secularized culture. You need to be prepared for it. So every time I do a harassment policy, I have a paragraph that I always use that separates out religion, makes very clear we claim every exemption we are entitled to legally, and says religious speech is not to be considered a form of harassment or retaliation. So I'd encourage that in any policies you do. And then finally, your harassment policy is going to have to address the question of sex, and whether we continue to be very clear that sex means what it has always meant, which is a male-female gender binary, or whether it includes, as has been increasingly pushed by different federal agencies and advocacy groups, that it includes sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, we all know the Supreme Court may answer this question in its next term. We can all pray that it is answered accurately, but we still need to answer it accurately in our policies. Well, let me jump from that into the second policy that is no less important. You really need a child protection policy. Now, we'd suggest you adopt something at a diocesan level that also gives your churches some degree of guidance. That's not a one-size-fits-all question because there are really challenging issues of liability. Are you setting a standard of care that will harm the churches if they're sued, or are you giving them resources? So the basic point is think about it, pray about it, and don't fail to do something about it due to inertia. Address it proactively. Our diocese, the Diocese of the Mid-Atlantic, has a policy that we've used and developed over the years. It's available on the website, anglicandoma.org, that we encourage anyone who wants it to take it. Other dioceses have done similar things. Those are great resources to look at. Okay, third policy I want to recommend is some form of policy on sexual morality or on sexual misconduct, sexual morality, or a statement on marriage and human sexuality. And the point there is, you may want to think, how do we want to address the more challenging issues of the moment we're living in? Now, the good news is, our provincial canons are, as a friend of mine likes to say, theologically unconfused on that question. They're quite clear. If we had to go to court with nothing but the provincial canons, I think we're ahead of the game. Most of your dioceses have diocesan canons. That may be enough. If you want a next step, there is a statement that the Task Force on Marriage, Family, and the Single Life put together. Dr. Stephen Knoll did a lot of the foundational work that the College of Bishops adopted in Vancouver literally the day before Obergefell was handed down by the U.S. Supreme Court. And that policy is still available. We can send you copies of it. That may be enough. You can just say, we embrace that. But don't be silent on that question. And that leads into considering whether you should have a sexual misconduct policy. And the idea there is to define that there are various forms of sexual activity that may be culturally acceptable, but are not biblically faithful. And therefore, it is a violation. Now, I worry about this less for our dioceses because we've got a stronger foundation. But for all my religious nonprofit ministry clients, I emphasize again and again, if you want to be able to discipline for the misconduct, You have to put the person on notice that this is misconduct, that it's not okay. And then finally, just an essential is insurance coverage. Make sure you've thought about, do you have all the insurance you need? And particularly, does it give you costs of defense if you get into a lawsuit over some of these activities? That may require additional riders, additional coverages, and you may want to think about, is it worth paying to get the right to choose your own counsel if you're sued and you want coverage under the policy? Okay. Just a final point, and this is from the materials I'll usually cover on sexual misconduct. Responding to allegations is too late in many cases, because if certain things have not happened before the allegation occurs, you are not equipped to deal with the allegation. The first example is harassment. Under the Supreme Court's 1998 Farragher and Ellerth cases, if you have a policy on harassment that is a defense to a lawsuit for harassment, not a final defense, but it is a strong defense. Conversely, the absence of a harassment policy essentially means you are liable for the harassment, and the question is, what's the remedy, what are the damages? So that's yet one more reason